There's been a book on my reading list for a while, and one of my patrons has also asked what I think about it. So I've recently read through it, and I'm now going to give you an overview of the argument presented in this book, which is on the history of eugenics, with the idea that eugenics led to Hitler and that National Socialism was a eugenic program from top to bottom. It's a really interesting theory, really intriguing from an intellectual curiosity point of view, and I think some of what I'm about to tell you is right, specifically Hitler was into eugenics, but I have identified some problems with this narrative which I think could be wrong. So what I'm going to do is walk you through Samaan's book, show you some of the problems I've found with it, and then I'll let you guys decide where we should go from here. Is it right? Is it a crank theory? Or is there something to it, even though there are some problems? Should I do more reading on the subject? Let me know, give me feedback, and we'll go from there. So, Samaan's book is written backwards. It starts in the 1940s and works its way backwards in time to the 1840s. And if you're not aware, this is not how most historians do history. I kind of understand why he did it, because the important stuff is in the 1940s, but I really don't like it. I've shown in the past that when historians play around with the order of events, it often leads to distortions, and there's absolutely no reason why you cannot go in chronological order. And the fact that Samaan doesn't do that is the first red flag. It doesn't necessarily mean he's deliberately distorting things, but it really makes me question if that's a possibility. To be sure, I'm not going to go backwards in this video. We'll start at the beginning and work our way forwards. But just to preempt something that will become important later, I need to remind people of some ideas that I've mentioned in previous videos. Back in ancient Greece, we have guys like Plato and Heraclitus, who came up with various concepts, including the idea of life as struggle, which the Germans called Kampfgesetz. As Peikoff explains in the book The Cause of Hitler's Germany, Plato says there are two dimensions: the physical, material world, which we can touch and feel, and then the spiritual realm of non-material perfection. And throughout the rest of the book, Peikoff shows how Plato is the source of mysticism and collectivism in the West, although Plato was heavily inspired by Heraclitus and Pythagoras. So, Heraclitus influences Plato, who influences everyone else, basically, but Thomas Aquinas rediscovered Aristotle in the 13th century, and Aristotle stood for reason and logic, and thus was mostly against mysticism. Therefore, Aristotle's rediscovery resulted in the Renaissance and the decline of mysticism. Concerned by this development, Immanuel Kant, who was an incredibly influential German philosopher and theologian, wanted to save religion from science, and did this by reviving Platonism and the ideas of Heraclitus. From Kant we then get Hegel, and then we arrive in the 1840s, which is where Samaan's narrative comes in. Samaan's story, if written in chronological order, starts in the aftermath of the 1848 revolution, when a biologist in Britain started to theorise publicly about evolution. This man was called Richard Owen. According to Samaan, this was Britain's leading biologist at the time, and Owen had already advocated an evolutionary theory before Darwin's Origin of Species. However, this theory was slightly different to Darwin's, which we'll see in a moment. Owen stated in 1849 that animal species, including man, had originated by natural laws or secondary causes, rather than by divine intervention, beating Darwin to the punch by a decade. And unlike Darwin, who Samaan says looked outwards to see the external processes of evolution, Owen argued that there was an inner cause for the origin of species. Samaan says we now know that Owen was correct, and that we now call this inner cause genetics. But Owen wasn't the father of genetics. That title goes to a man called Gregor Johann Mendel, who was a cleric. According to Samaan, Mendel was assisted by monks while he stayed at a monastery, and noticed that his pea plants acted in a certain way. If he mixed yellow and green peas together, the first generation would always produce yellow peas, yet green peas would appear again in the generation after that. And just like with Richard Owen, Mendel had discovered that something internal, genes, created the evolutionary process, not something external, and that's why he was considered the father of modern genetics. Now, unlike Owen, who was prominent at the time but also ridiculed, Mendel was deliberately ignored by the scientific community when he published his findings in 1865, and his work wasn't rediscovered until the 20th century, 3 decades later. So why did the scientific community ignore these guys? Well, we now turn to Charles Darwin. On the Origin of Species was published in 1859 by co-authors Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace. According to Samaan, modern evolutionary theory became Darwin's theory, even though evolution was being talked about by others before Darwin, and even though Wallace was there with Darwin as well. Why was Wallace ignored and forgotten about? Supposedly it was because Wallace was a spiritualist. A.R. Wallace was the co-founder of the theory of natural selection and a solid supporter of Darwin, but he combined evolutionism with spiritualism, and tried to understand human evolution and evolutionary ethics with a spiritualist teleology. This teleological version is a typical example of non-Darwinian evolutionism, which was rooted in the ideology of Victorian progressivism and was used to avoid the materialism implicated in Darwinism. Through investigating Wallace's approach, we may realise how progressivism had worked as the bridge between science and religion in the Victorian age. Wallace believed in telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition, meaning foreknowledge of future events, levitation, and spirit communication, amongst other things. And this guy was working with Charles Darwin. Why on earth is Charles Darwin, the scientist, working with this spiritualist? In published papers concerning the origin of man, Wallace never included among the troubling facts his or others' spiritualist experiences. Yet he had his own conviction that natural selection was insufficient to explain the origin of man, and that man's origin required the action of higher intelligences guiding the laws of organic development. It is argued that Wallace's overt spiritualism only came to light after The Origin of Species was published, and this is probably true. However, Wallace was deliberately sidelined for Darwin right from the get-go, suggesting that there was something going on before Wallace became overtly spiritual. The narrative goes that Darwin travelled the world on the HMS Beagle and observed an external evolutionary process whereby creatures would be isolated or adapt to their environments, and this would cause breakaway species groups. These groups would then compete with each other in a survival of the fittest, life as struggle scenario, which is supposedly a new idea, even though it's been around since the time of Heraclitus and the ancient Greeks. Hence why I gave the background information before. As even Marx and Engels pointed out at the time, Charles Darwin's law of natural selection was in fact inspired by a debunked economist, Thomas Robert Malthus, who was also a cleric and wanted to progress society towards utopia, and even Wikipedia says this. Darwin's ideas were inspired by the observations he had made on the second voyage of HMS Beagle, 1831-1836, and by the work of a political economist, Thomas Robert Malthus. Thomas Robert Malthus was an English economist, cleric and scholar influential in the fields of political economy and demography. Malthus considered population growth as inevitable whenever conditions improved, thereby precluding real progress towards a utopian society. The power of population is indefinitely greater than the power in the earth to produce subsistence for man. As an Anglican cleric, he saw this situation as divinely imposed to teach virtuous behaviour. Malthus was so imprecise and incorrect he should have been long forgotten. Unfortunately, as Marx and Engels point out, Malthus lives through Darwin. Why is Darwin working with and inspired by clerics, political ideologues, and spiritualists? And what did Darwin actually say? Owen suggested an inner genetic cause for the origin of species, which Samaan says ended up being correct, while Darwin made up an external cause. And let's just ponder a question. Under Darwin's theory, who selects the fittest species to survive? Nature, fate, providence, the true God behind the demiurge. Samaan and others argue that, contrary to popular belief, it was Darwin who was the creationist. Throughout The Origin of Species, Darwin contrasts his theory of natural selection with the theory that God independently created each species. This makes it seem as though The Origin offers a scientific alternative to a theological worldview. A few months after The Origin appeared, however, the eminent anatomist Richard Owen published a review that pointed out the theological assumptions of Darwin's theory. Owen worked in the tradition of rational morphology, within which one might suggest that evolution occurs by processes that are continuous with those by which life arises from matter. In contrast, Darwin rested his account on life's origins on the notion that God created one or a few life forms upon which natural selection could act. Owen argued that Darwin's reliance on God to explain the origins of life makes his version of evolution no less supernatural than the special creationist that Darwin criticises. Although Darwin limits God to one or a few acts of creation, he still relies upon God to explain life's existence. So, according to this narrative, Darwin wasn't an atheist, and Darwinism isn't science, it's a religion. Not Christian, probably Gnostic. Samaan explains in his book that the theory of evolution and Darwin had nothing to do with a debate between theology and science. But, he says, the propaganda has painted it as such, and has smeared Owen's and Mendel's internal evolutionary process, genetics, as creationism, even though that's the real science. And so, Darwinism and natural selection has nothing to do with science, and could be described as a modernised version of what Plato and Heraclitus were talking about 2,500 years before. Karl Marx even said that he saw the Malthusian struggle for existence in Darwin's work, and that it reminded him of Hegel's idea, where bourgeois society figured as a spiritual animal kingdom, which is a concept we can trace back to Heraclitus. So in other words, Darwin saw the animal kingdom as bourgeois society something to be overcome. And Engels points out that the so-called scientific community had done a 180. Before Darwin, the very people who now see nothing but struggle for existence everywhere were stressing precisely the cooperation in organic nature. How the vegetable kingdom supplies the animal kingdom with oxygen and foodstuffs, while the animal kingdom in turn supplies the vegetable kingdom with carbonic acid and manures. Now, Marx and Engels weren't on Darwin's side here. They didn't like Malthus, or anyone else for that matter. But the point that Samaan is making is that the scientific community almost wholeheartedly rallied behind what was essentially a religious theory. And, as we said before, Owen suggested an inner genetic cause for the origin of species, while Darwin made up an external cause. Owen believed that humanity was united and distant from the apes, while Darwin believed in different human races. According to Samaan, Darwin believed in racial hierarchies, with the lower humans, in Darwin's views the blacks, being closer to the higher apes than they were to the white people. And Darwin's theory says that nature selects the best and fittest elite species to survive, which then leads to the conclusion that evolution is progressing towards an end goal, an Aryan master race, which we can then help along through central planning, selective breeding, segregation, euthanasia, and so on. All ideas that were and are embraced by eugenicism. Whereas Mendel's genetics, according to Samaan, argues that new iterations come through a diversity of genes, not isolation and inbreeding. Meaning, The real science was saying one thing, while the religion of the science was saying something else. The result was that the scientific idea of an internal evolutionary process that affects individuals, not species, was cast aside, and a theology of social species, social Darwinism, was implanted into the narrative and became the doctrine that we all must believe in. Now, this controversial narrative that Samaan makes is interesting, to say the least, and on the surface, makes a lot of sense. Samaan is then able to argue that Darwinism leads to eugenics, which then leads to the Nazis and their crimes. So, Samaan says, Darwin is at fault. But is this really the case? One of Samaan's sources is a guy called Descartes, who wrote a book called From Darwin to Hitler, Evolutionary Ethics, Eugenics and Racism in Germany. It's very expensive to buy at the moment, so I haven't read it. However, Wikipedia says that Descartes was a creationist who is trying to link Hitler to Darwin in order to undermine evolutionary theory and thus give credence to creationism. And in the book Was Hitler a Darwinian?, Richards explains that Descartes is a religious conservative thinker and, along with others, made very dubious claims. Now, to be fair to Samaan, he doesn't entirely agree with Descartes and comes to a very different conclusion. But he still uses him as a source, and Descartes' narrative sets the stage for what Samaan says. Richard Descartes' highly controversial book, From Darwin to Hitler, points to a dizzying amount of connections between Darwin and Hitler. With all due respect for Mr. Descartes, the path is not as serpentine as he makes it. The relationships are direct and linear. Darwin proclaimed that evolution could work backward, and that humanity could degenerate into an inferior type, close to man's ape origins, and this fear fueled the development of eugenics. Charles Darwin's fame also provided a cloak of scientific legitimacy to eugenics, which he would not have enjoyed if it were not fully based on his theory of evolution. The Darwinist zealots then and now strike at anyone who dares question Darwin, and the science of eugenics was a direct beneficiary of this zealous closing of the ranks. Proposals that were morally suspect went uncontested and unchallenged, allowing them to survive and later to thrive under Hitler. And Descartes says, if you open Mein Kampf and read it, especially if you can read it in German, the correspondence between Darwinian ideas and Nazi ideas just leaps from the page. And Richard says, put Darwin and Hitler in a search engine and hundreds of thousands of hits will be returned, most from religiously and politically conservative websites, articles and books. Even though I've not done a super deep dive on this, I have found a problem with Samaan's narrative. Towards the end of the book, which it should be the beginning, Samaan concludes that Charles Darwin was saying that Africans were closer to apes than they were to white men. Both societies, namely the ethnological societies Huxley and Darwin, vocally proposed that Africans were closer to apes than to white men. The gulf between the lowest creature which can still be stylized man and our highest races is greater than that between the lowest type of man and the highest ape. Darwinian racial hierarchy, with European whites as the pinnacle of human evolution, and Aborigines and Africans closer to apes than to whites, tied Darwin's theory of YouTube censorship selection and Morel's theory of degeneracy to fabricate the fear that intimate relations between European whites and any other race would inevitably result in a biological retrogression. And yet, here is a quote from Darwin in The Descent of Man saying the exact opposite. Man differs so greatly in his mental power from all other animals. No doubt the difference in this respect is enormous, even if we compare the mind of one of our lowest savages, who has no words to express any higher number than 4, and who uses no abstract terms for the commonest objects or affections, with that of the most highly organized ape. The difference would, no doubt, still remain immense. He also says, I cannot therefore understand how it is that Mr. Wallace maintains that natural selection could only have endowed the savage with a brain a little superior to that of an ape. So now we have a problem. Samaan has concluded that Charles Darwin was saying that Africans were closer to apes than they were to white men, even though we have direct quotes from Charles Darwin himself stating that there is an immense difference between them and apes, and that he doesn't agree with Mr. Wallace, who was the one who was saying savages had brains similar to apes. From what I can tell, the closest Darwin gets to saying this is when he says that ancient races were closer to animals than modern races, and in another instance he says apes are much given to imitation, as are the lowest savages. But that's it. Maybe I've missed the bit where he says that the Africans are closer to apes, so fair enough if I have, but there's even a part where he says that the minds of Aborigines and Africans are similar to Europeans. So while this isn't a complete rebuttal, it does cast doubt on what Samaan is saying. This is coupled with the fact that I've noticed another error, which I may as well mention now, relating to Hitler in the post-World War I era. Samaan says it was Konstantin Hirl who ordered Hitler to attend the meeting of the German Workers' Party, which appears to be wrong. Now, to be fair, the Jewish Virtual Library says it was Konstantin Hirl who did this, so he's not the only one to say it, but the Jewish Virtual Library lists Wikipedia as its only source, and when you go to the now updated Wikipedia page, it no longer says Hirl did this because, or probably because, someone realised it was wrong. Ian Kershaw, in his biography of Hitler, says it was Captain Karl Mayer who gave Hitler the order, as does Thomas Weber in Hitler's First War. So, I think the problem here is that Samaan is using unreliable sources to form the narrative that he's crafting, and these sources have led him to the wrong conclusions. And these are just two errors that I've spotted so far, which makes me think there's probably more. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe they're the only errors, and I just happen to have found both of them. However, coupled with the dubious decision to write his book backwards, it really does cast doubt on what Samaan is saying. But going back to the question over whether Hitler was inspired by Darwinism, Richards also makes the case that Hitler's theories on race don't actually come from Darwin, and are, in fact, anti-Darwinian in nature. Rather than Darwin, Hitler's getting his ideas from Houston Stewart Chamberlain, who did, in fact, reject Darwinism. Chamberlain used the trope of racial struggle frequently in his book Foundations. Indeed, the phrase usually identified with Darwinian theory, struggle for existence, Kampf ums Dasein, appears 8 times in the Foundations. The single word struggle, Kampf, turns up 112 times. But these terms were not markers of Darwin's theory of natural selection. Chamberlain rejected Darwin's conception completely, comparing it to the old discredited phlogiston theory. Not only did he dismiss Darwin's main explanatory device, but he rejected transmutation of species altogether. After all, it was an idea already refuted in advance by Kant. Hitler mentions Houston Stewart Chamberlain in Mein Kampf. His work is directly inspired by Chamberlain, and they both met each other in person and also had correspondence. So there's no doubt that Hitler was influenced by Chamberlain. Coupled with the origins of National Socialist ideology, which I've covered in previous videos, it does appear that Hitler's racism isn't coming from Darwinian origins. It's coming from somewhere else, and before I give you my opinion on this, Richards points out that Hitler was looking for racial purity, an idea coming from Chamberlain, and struggle, Kampf. Both of these are not Darwinian concepts. According to Richards, Darwin didn't promote racial purity, and while the word Kampf was used in the Darwinian concept of struggle for existence, Hitler only uses that phrase twice in Mein Kampf. Most of the time he's just using the word Kampf by itself, or other words and phrases that aren't struggle for existence. In the 2 instances where he does use struggle for existence, he's talking about Lebensraum. saying that Germans need to take the lands and resources of the East in order to have the living space needed to survive. Well, as Richards explains, this actually goes against Darwin's theory. Hitler's argument makes little sense from a Darwinian perspective. If living conditions became restricted within closed borders, it would be the more fit who would survive, whereas if conditions became relaxed by moving into an unoccupied and fruitful land, then the fit and the less fit, by some measure, ought to have fairly equal chances. Hence, from a Darwinian point of view, the conclusion ought to be just opposite to the one Hitler drew. Richard says that Hitler got his racial theories from Chamberlain, Wagner and Hegel, saying that the struggle of spirit is coming from Hegel, which we also know comes from Kant, Plato and Heraclitus. And Richards is not some far-right ultra-nationalist religious conservative guy, since he's actually rallying against those views in his book. Yet even he can pinpoint the ideological origins of National Socialism to Hegel at least, making National Socialism a religion. I agree with Richards that Hitler's racism isn't a scientific racism based on genetics or Darwinism. It may have been influenced by these concepts, but its origins were clearly in the mysticism realm. I've said before about Gnosticism, but even if it wasn't that specifically, it's clearly got a religious or cult-like origin based on purifying the soul of the people, guided by providence, and changing, requiring contradictions, Aufheben, and a spiritual salvation and rebirth. Hitler is waging a spiritual war, and National Socialism is a religion. There's no science there, which is also why they believed in world ice theory, a concept whose origins, I recently discovered, comes from the first known philosopher in ancient Greece, Thales. There are a couple of things in Samaan's narrative that I do agree with though. Darwin clearly wasn't the only guy who came up with the theory of evolution. Others were there doing the work at the same time. So it is weird that it's become Darwin's theory. And I do agree with Samaan when he says that eugenics is inherent within the idea of natural selection and survival of the fittest. Darwinism and social Darwinism are one and the same thing. I know Richards argues against this, I'll get to him in a second, but they really are one and the same thing. I've looked at numerous websites for an explanation on what the differences are and why social Darwinism is bad, and not one of them really explains why. The reason is because the counter to social Darwinism is the counter to Darwinism itself, because they are both the same, which is why they can't give you a reason. Richard says that there are 6 things that make up Darwinism and social Darwinism. Both concepts share the first 4 points, which are human races form hierarchies from lower to higher, laws of nature apply equally to animals and men, there is a struggle among human groups, humans can control the struggle to the advantage of the superior races. Richards then says that the next 2 are not what Darwin believes, just what the social Darwinists believe. That 5, the superior race is permitted to police its own group by eliminating their inferiors to promote sound hereditary features, and 6, the superior race may exterminate the lower races. He then concludes that since Darwin didn't believe in these last 2 points, then we shouldn't even call it social Darwinism, since it has nothing to do with Darwinism. The problem is that the ideas present in the first 4 points naturally lead to the conclusion of the 5th and 6th points. If life is a struggle and the fittest gets selected by external forces, and then humans can control the struggle to the advantage of the superior races, then what other conclusion could you come to? Many people to this day come to these conclusions. So while Hitler doesn't get his ideas from Darwin as such, Darwin's theory does lead to eugenics, which is why eugenics became a thing after Charles Darwin published his theory. It's not just some random coincidence. We'll get to Charles Darwin's relatives, who became eugenicists, shortly. But while Samaan might be wrong in some of his details, it could be the case that the overall narrative regarding eugenics originating from Darwin could be right, even if it also had religious origins in ancient Greece. I'd have to do more work to confirm or deny it, but the argument that there's a difference between Darwinism and social Darwinism really doesn't hold up. Also, here's an interesting passage from Richard's book. Initially, through the 1910s and 1920s, Mendelian genetics and Darwinian natural selection theory were often regarded as opposed, with the former considered to be real science and the latter romantic butterfly collecting. During the next 2 decades, however, biologists discovered their complementary features, and as a result, Mendelian genetics and Darwinian evolutionary theory became joined in the synthetic framework that now serves as the foundation of modern biological science. If, then, genetics is the real science, and Darwinism is a religious concept, as Samaan suggests, then obviously that would explain why it took so long for them to be integrated into each other. And I would point out that Samaan doesn't appear to be making a creationist argument. He's saying that Darwin is the creationist, which is a very different take, from Descartes or whoever. So Richard's refutation of Descartes and the creationist argument doesn't apply to Samaan, and certainly doesn't refute his argument. From what I can tell, Samaan isn't a creationist, and he's not making a creationist argument. He's criticising the creationist argument by accusing Darwin of being a creationist. But if we continue with Samaan's narrative, this is where things start to get a bit more concrete. And to understand the evolution of Darwinist eugenics, we have to go through a bunch of other characters. Around the same time as Darwin, Benedict Augustin Morel started to theorise on the evolution of species and became the director of a mental asylum in Nancy in 1848, where he pondered the question as to why people become mentally ill. Combining concepts of acquired traits becoming fixed in germ plasm, drug toxicity, and hereditary transmission, Morel described a progressive generational degeneration starting with neurosis in the first generation, mental alienation in the next, and imbecility in the third, culminating in sterility in the fourth and final generation. Morel's negative evolutionary theories saw racial degeneration as a consequence of uncontrolled reproduction of degenerates and cretins, and Morel proposed that these inferiors should be segregated and sterilised. He published his findings in 1857, beating Darwin by a year or so. Which is interesting because the conclusion must be that eugenics doesn't originate with Darwin or Galton, as it's an older concept. And while Morel's idea clearly wasn't a universal theory of evolution, it was certainly moving in that direction, and once again shows that Darwin wasn't alone in his creation. From Morel and Darwin, we then get Darwin's brother-in-law, Francis Galton, who took their theories and combined them together in the 1860s, and in the 1870s Galton turned natural selection into rational selection, whereby humans could select who got to live or die to pass on their traits to their offspring. Galton coined the term eugenics in 1883, but right from the beginning, Francis Galton's work was awash with racism, much like Darwin's. A race of sane men may be formed who shall be as much superior mentally and morally to the modern European as the modern European is to the lowest of the N-word races. Samaan gives plenty of examples of Galton's racism and contrasts his vulgar assessment of the various peoples of the world with the actual scientific work of Friedrich Nietzsche, who discovered DNA in 1869. Samaan's overall point is to show that the Darwinists and eugenicists weren't really scientists, but political activists looking to justify their utopian visions. Despite calling itself a science, the allegedly respectable scientists of eugenics, such as Francis Galton and Julian Huxley, spent an inordinate amount of time mapping out proposals for legislative, legal, and governmental initiatives, as opposed to spending this time on actual scientific experimentation. Along with Galton, there's another guy called Ernst Haeckel, and both of these were pushing for Darwinism and eugenics to become a religion, with Haeckel going so far as to fabricate evidence in favour of his claims. And it's not just Samaan saying this either. Wikipedia backs him up, or maybe it's the other way around. As Daniel Gasman points out, Haeckel's influence on Hitler's National Socialists is not debatable. Haeckel was admired by Ernst Rudin, Alfred Ploetz, and other key eugenicists that implemented the infamous Nuremberg laws. Haeckel himself fully subscribed to the myths of Aryan superiority popularised by proponents of theosophy and other occultist replacements for traditional religion. Theosophy is a Gnostic religion, and it's directly related to the Nazis, as it inspired the proto-Nazis and eventually led to the Thule Society. I've mentioned it before, so I won't go into it here, but the point is that there is a direct connection with Gnosticism or elitism throughout most of the characters involved in this story, and the same movements or ideas are cropping up over and over again. Just like with theosophy, with its made-up giants and supernatural root races, the social Darwinists also let their visions run wild. Haeckel's Anthropods illustration in the German edition of his 1869 book, The History of Creation, is the graphic depiction of Darwin's racialist evolutionary hierarchy, with the ape slowly morphing into an Aryan, passing through the Aborigine and African intermediaries, depicted as being more ape-like than their Caucasian counterparts. This chart was wholly pulled from Haeckel's imagination, and not at all from any discovery process of an empirical nature. Among the Spartans, all newly born children were subject to a careful examination and selection. All those that were weak, sickly, or affected with any bodily infirmity were killed. Only the perfectly healthy and strong children were allowed to live, and they alone afterwards propagated the race. The irony being that the Spartans didn't actually survive very long because of their stupid centrally planned regime. And I also did a video not too long ago where I showed how the modern third positionists believed that the Spartan phalanx was a great example of their socialism. However, here we can see that the early Darwinists and eugenicists were already advocating the idea of euthanasia, infanticide, segregation, sterilisation, selective breeding, purifying the blood of the race, and later on, birth control. And you might argue, okay, but that's just the social Darwinists calling for eugenicide, not the Darwinists. But here's a quote from Charles Darwin himself. At some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace throughout the world the savage races. At the same time, the anthropomorphous apes, as Professor Schaffenhausen has remarked, will no doubt be exterminated. The break will then be rendered wider, for it will intervene between man in a more civilized state, as we may hope, than the Caucasian, and some ape as low as the baboon, instead of, as at present, between the N-word, or Australian, and the gorilla. To be fair, he's not advocating for it, he's just saying it's going to happen. But clearly, Darwin has one foot in the door of eugenics and is predicting a race war, which is what many racists are predicting too. How exactly they're able to divinely see into the future, I'm not sure. Still, it shows that the 4 points of Darwinism lead to the 5th and 6th points of social Darwinism. And the ideas of the eugenicists certainly evolved over time, and I can't possibly go through every single step along the way, but Samaan does provide us with a list of books that he says lead to Mein Kampf. Some of these Hitler directly plagiarised, others might seem controversial, we'll discuss them shortly, but here they are. Benedict Augustin Morel's Treatise on Mental Illnesses 1857, Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species 1859, Francis Galton's Hereditary Genius 1869, Charles Darwin's The Descent of Man 1871, Ernst Haeckel's The Evolution of Man 1871, Cesare Lombroso's Criminal Man according to the classification of Cesare Lombroso 1887, Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward 1888, Max Nordau's Degeneration 1892, Nietzsche's The Will to Power 1901, Madison Grant's The Passing of the Great Race, 1906. Hooker and Binding's Allowing the Destruction of Life Unworthy of Living, 1920. Henry Ford's The International Jew, 1920. The Bauer-Fischer-Lenz book Principles of Human Hereditary and Racial Hygiene, 1921. And Harry H. Laughlin's Model Eugenical Sterilization Law, 1922. Mein Kampf was then published in 1925, and Samaan makes the case that Hitler's speeches prior to this point don't have an argument for eugenics in them. He says that only comes after his stay in Landsberg prison, when he reads most of the books we just mentioned. But, as many historians have pointed out, Hitler doesn't actually state his intention to commit a genocide of the Jews in Mein Kampf, or did he? Yeah, it's true he doesn't mention the word genocide, but he does use Darwin's word exterminated. The nationalisation of the masses can be successfully achieved only if, in the positive struggle to win the soul of the people, those who spread the international poison among them are exterminated. As Hitler stated elsewhere, the international poison are the Jews, who Hitler said were the capitalists and the Marxists. And if you read Mein Kampf in its entirety, it becomes clear that Hitler does want to destroy the Jews, because how else is he meant to keep the Aryan blood pure? So it's not just this one sentence alone that shows Hitler's intent at this stage, although it is probably the most overt statement. But I do agree with Samaan's assessment here that we're a long way between this one sentence and Auschwitz, and so the next 4 books that came after Mein Kampf pushed history down the road to mass murder. These were Leonard Darwin's The Need for Eugenic Reform, 1926, the Human Betterment Foundation's Collected Papers on Eugenic Sterilization in California, a critical study of results in 6,000 cases, 1930. Leon F. Whitney's The Case for Sterilization, 1934. And Alexis Carroll's Man, the Unknown, 1935. A really important figure in this story was Edward Bellamy, who was a socialist, but thought that the term socialism was foreign. So he called his socialism nationalism. Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward, published in 1888, depicts a centrally planned eugenic utopia where all the citizens are part of an industrial army. Samaan says that Bellamy would go on to inspire many within the Roosevelt administration, but also many Germans as well. It was discovered that in the reading lists of German factory workers targeted by socialist propaganda during the turn of the century, Edward Bellamy and Darwin were among the most popular. Bellamy started a worldwide movement of nationalist clubs that wanted to nationalise the industries to gain solidarity in a collectivised society. And it was his daughter, Marion Bellamy, who coined the socialist or nationalist phrase, from cradle to grave. The public school system in the United States, along with the Pledge of Allegiance that school children recite every morning, were the creations of Edward and Frances Bellamy. He, Edward Bellamy, has been conveniently and likely intentionally erased from the public conscience, as Bellamy was the first to marry the terms national and socialism, and is the father of progressivism, fascism, and Fabian socialism as well. I've been pointing out for a while now that a nation is a society. Nationalism is socialism. There's no difference between the nationalisation of the means of production or the socialisation of the means of production. They are one and the same thing. In reality, one nation that conquers the world is still a nation. The so-called internationalism of Marxist socialism is just that, so-called. The Aryan citizens of this international nation are the proletariat, while the foreigners are the capitalist bourgeoisie, or as Karl Marx called them, the Jews. So Edward Bellamy's socialism was renamed to nationalism, cementing the idea that they are just variants of the same disease. And Bellamy inspired the third way idea, along with people like Leonard Darwin, Charles Darwin's son, who we'll get to shortly. The similarities between Edward Bellamy's industrial army and Adolf Hitler's National Socialist German Workers' Party are far from academic either. The infamous 1934 film Triumph of the Will, directed by Leni Riefenstahl, shows the National Socialist workers parading their industrial army. The foot soldiers in Riefenstahl's choreographed parades are filmed carrying farming implements. Hitler's speech in the movie echoes Edward Bellamy, as Hitler's monologue frequents the themes of the epitome of altruism, and the various supporting speakers refer to each other as comrades who will cause a revolution of the people and workers to end class struggle and create egalitarianism. These are the unmistakable battle cries of utopian socialism and cannot be understood as anything else considering their historical context. One of the books mentioned was Nietzsche's The Will to Power, published in 1901. And just like with Darwin, this will no doubt upset some Nietzsche fans. They like to try and distance themselves from Hitler, but ultimately there was an influence here. And to understand this, let's just back up a moment. The Jews and the Christian churches were both in opposition to what Hitler was doing. Why? Because thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not take the property of the Jews, put them in ghettos and concentration camps, beat, starve and murder them. The Ten Commandments were against the very essence of the Holocaust, which is why Hitler fought a war against both the Jews and the Christians. Hitler even says that Christianity was a Jewish idea, and he wanted to remove the Jewish Ten Commandments from society whilst promoting the ancient idea of eternal struggle. Amongst others, Nietzsche had given the philosophical argument against the Jewish idea of the Ten Commandments. Sin is a Jewish feeling and a Jewish invention, and in view of this background to all Christian morality, Christianity was in fact out to Jewify the entire world. While many of Nietzsche's works have been criticised as being proto-Nazi, Nietzsche's followers aptly point to the oversimplification of Nietzsche's Overman in comparison to Hitler's master race. This oversimplification does not release Nietzsche from fault. It is Nietzsche's pronounced derision towards the traditional values of human compassion and the sentimentality that were ultimately crucial and indispensable towards committing genocide. The bottom line is that if one desires to enlist a population in participating in a protracted and methodical genocidal campaign, the first order of business is to harden their hearts and nullify their sentimentality. Samaan isn't the only one saying this either. Peikoff says Nietzsche was a massive influence on Nazi thought, even if his views didn't entirely align. Nietzsche was a romanticist who was influenced by Kant and viewed the universe as a clash of wills, of struggle, and said the Superman would triumph and rule over the lesser peoples. In Nietzsche's Will to Power, he says we have to reject the mind and rely on passion, which, as Peikoff argues, resulted in a rejection of logic and reason in favour of an emotional irrationality based on mysticism that allowed men to conduct the Holocaust. Hitler even told Hans Frank that during his stay in Landsberg, he read a bunch of authors including Houston Stewart Chamberlain, Ranke, Marx, Bismarck and Nietzsche. So Hitler himself is listing Nietzsche as a source. And in the Table Talks, Hitler refers to Nietzsche as one of Germany's greatest thinkers, alongside Schopenhauer and Kant. So I do think Samaan's right here. Nietzsche's philosophy influences Hitler and the National Socialists and is a contributing factor to the Holocaust. This book belongs to the most rare of men. He must have an inclination, born of strength, for questions that no one has the courage for. The courage for the forbidden, predestination for the labyrinth, the experience of 7 solitudes. Of that sort only are my readers, my true readers, my readers foreordained. Of what account are the rest? The rest are merely humanity. One must make oneself superior to humanity in power, in loftiness of soul, in contempt. Nietzsche's philosophy is a brand of elitism, and some people have argued that he was a Gnostic. He asked his readers to isolate themselves just like every good cultist does. Many cult groups seem to gain influence and control over their members through a process of increasing isolation and estrangement from mainstream society. And before Darwin and Nietzsche, the belief in the sanctity of human life dominated European thought and law. Judeo-Christian ethics prescribed the killing of innocent human beings, and the Christian churches explicitly forbade these 4 things that YouTube has also forbidden me to say. The sanctity of human life became enshrined in classical liberal human rights ideology as the right to life, which according to John Locke and the Declaration of Independence was one of the inalienable rights of every individual. This natural right was reflected in European legal codes. But Darwin and Nietzsche changed all that, and Leonard Darwin, son of Charles Darwin, wrote a book in 1926 called The Need for Eugenic Reform. It advocated eugenicide, warning that if we didn't do it, we would condemn our nation to disaster. Samaan says that, inspired by Bellamy, Leonard Darwin actively lobbied the British government on social and economic policies, proposing that British society be collectivised under a nationalistic version of socialism. At the same time, he said that individual rights had to be subordinated to the collective right, and the unfit needed to be removed. He proposed that if couples had 3 children, all state benefits should be removed from them, and if the state authorities deemed the 3 children to be living in poor conditions, then the father and mother should be segregated from each other. He said that since wages are earned by people's natural capabilities, the superior beings naturally rise to the top of society, and since superior beings rise to the top, future generations would be improved if the poor were prevented from having children. So not only was this elitism, but Leonard Darwin wanted to prevent the poor from breeding. The aim of eugenicists is to alter the human surroundings in such a way as to increase the chance of survival of those types which are held to be most desirable. And consequently, in eugenic discussions, the fittest is a term sometimes used to indicate those who ought to survive in the evolutionary sense, that is, to help to people the earth, rather than those who actually do survive. Natural selection seems to take no thought as to what is good, whilst in eugenic problems the moral qualities of man should be the primary consideration. Nature shows no concern for the suffering she causes by her methods of eliminating the less fit, and if natural selection were our guide, our duties would include the getting rid of all inferior human beings, no matter how. Natural selection points to no kindness being shown by man to inferior animals or to other tribes. Nothing is to be learned from biology as to the ultimate aims of our existence, and but little as to the exact ways in which the evolutionary method should be utilised in eugenic reform. If Leonard Darwin did say this, then this doesn't sound any different to Hitler. And Samaan explains that both Charles Darwin and Leonard Darwin believed that intermarriage between whites and the inferior races would lead to the deterioration of the human species. They said we'd end up regressing back to our ape origins, calling this degeneration, a word many third positionists use frequently when referring to today's society. In a proposal that eerily foreshadows the Jewish ghettos of Hitler's Germany, Leonard Darwin calls for us to consider the creation of eugenic communities by segregating the superior as well as restricting the reproduction of the inferior in order to create a eugenic superior caste. According to Samaan, Leonard Darwin called for segregation, eugenics tribunals to search through family histories to find undesirable and unfit ancestors, and wanted eugenics to become a religion. Anyone familiar with National Socialism, the Third Reich, the Nuremberg laws, and the Action T4 program will see the eerie similarities of what Leonard Darwin was proposing and what actually happened. What Samaan does is show that by the end of the 1800s, the medical and scientific communities were all aboard the idea of eugenics and racial hygiene as it came to be known. In fact, they were the ones who had invented the concepts, with Alfred Plotz coining the term racial hygiene. And again, While it's not possible for me to sit here and show you every single step along the way, we're actually able to trace the evolution of eugenicism through the personal relationships of the people involved. From Charles Darwin to Francis Galton to Leonard Darwin, who was a friend of Harry H. Laughlins. Laughlin, a member of the American Congress, was the man who had written the Model Eugenical Sterilization Law in the United States in 1922, which resulted in compulsory sterilization of thousands of Americans, which Samaan says was sponsored by the Rockefeller, Carnegie, Kellogg, and other institutions. Hitler's regime published several of Laughlin's publications, and Laughlin even travelled to Germany to accept rewards from the Nazis. Another friend of Leonard Darwin was a guy called Ernst Rudin, who took over the Third International Eugenics Congress from Leonard Darwin. Rudin was a director at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, and his brother-in-law was Alfred Ploetz. Alfred Ploetz hadn't just coined the term racial hygiene, but had been the vice president of the British Eugenics Society in 1916 and later was instrumental in implementing Hitler's racial state. In 1933, Reich Interior Minister Wilhelm Frick established an expert advisory committee for population and racial policy, which included Ploetz, Fritz Lenz, Ernst Rudin, and Hans F. K. Gunther. We've seen Hans Gunther before. He was the race pope. Gunther wrote about the Nordic race as well as the 4 other previous races because he was a mystic. He also warned about the dangers of mixing blood with their eastern neighbours, and it was from the race pope that Hitler got the idea that Aryan blood is what builds nations. And, probably with Houston Stewart Chamberlain's ideas, when Aryan blood is mixed with the lesser blood, civilization collapses. Well, from Gunther, Ernst Rudin and Alfred Ploetz, plus others, we then get the Nuremberg laws. The infamous 1933 eugenic laws, otherwise known as the Nuremberg laws, were largely a verbatim copy of Laughlin's model sterilization law, specifically the 1933 Law for the Prevention of Hereditarily Diseased Offspring. Samaan likes to repeat this point over and over, that the Nuremberg laws were a verbatim copy of Laughlin's model sterilization law that had been enacted in the United States. It gets a bit old after the 50th time, and I would class this as another reason why this book is flawed. Nonetheless, if true, he does have a valid point. Wikipedia does actually mention the connection, although I've not seen any other historians talk about it, so is it right? And there's a book called Hitler's American Model, the United States and the Making of Nazi Race Law, and in this book, James Wittmann makes the case that all 3 Nuremberg laws were influenced by American politics at the time, and the 2nd and 3rd Nuremberg laws were the ones based on American laws. Wittmann explains that America had several racist laws on its books that were eugenic, as well as non-eugenic, and what's interesting is that the Americans had a citizenship law that made Native Americans nationals rather than citizens. Much in the same way that the 2nd Nuremberg law, the citizenship law, would go on to make Jews nationals rather than citizens. And Puerto Ricans were defined the same way the Germans defined the Czechs, as foreign elements. Mazower is right. He is right, as we shall see shortly, that Hitler, following in the footsteps of Theodor Fritsch, admired American race law. And he is right that the treatment of Native Americans and Puerto Ricans, both carefully discussed in the German legal literature, offered models of second-class citizenship that intrigued Nazi policymakers. And at this time, despite the Civil War, black Americans were still second-class citizens under the law, and the way they were treated was noted by the Nazis themselves. In Mein Kampf, Hitler's second book, and the Nazi Party program, the idea that there were 2 classes of people, citizens and non-citizens, was laid out with inspiration from American law. Hitler actually mentions American racial law in his second book, and in Nazi texts from the time, where they explain the concept of citizenship, they made reference to American racial law, stating in one instance that America possesses a proud consciousness of Gemeinschaft, community. Wittmann makes the case that the blood law, the 3rd Nuremberg law, was a copy of an American law. Now, Whitman makes the case that the language of the law wasn't a direct copy, but rather a heavily influenced copy. So there are differences, most notably the fact that the Nazis targeted Jews rather than blacks. The bottom line is that the Nazis regarded American classification schemes as too harsh, and the American race problem as too different for any unmodified borrowing to have taken place. But what ultimately matters is that they knew that there was an American example, and indeed the example that they turned to first and over again. But Whitman fails to mention the sterilization law, which Samaan and Wikipedia and other websites say was a direct copy of Laughlин's law. So in the run-up to this video, I haven't been able to verify the claim using other historians. That's not to say that they didn't mention it somewhere, just that Whitman failed to talk about the sterilization law, even though his book is meant to be about the American influence on Nazi policy. However, because online sources do mention it, I am inclined to believe that it's true, and I can do a deep dive if you guys think it's necessary to do so. But continuing with Samaan, he says Ploetz was awarded professorship in 1936 by Hitler, and Ploetz joined the Nazi Party in 1937. Harry H. Laughlin and Karl Pearson were awarded honours by Hitler and received international recognition and press coverage. Ploetz was even nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize in 1936 for his work on eugenics. I'm not going to go into details regarding the eugenics policies of the Reich, that's a video for another day, but 400,000 people were sterilised throughout Germany as a result of the law of the prevention of hereditary diseased progeny, enacted on the 1st of January 1934, which was Laughlin's law, apparently. Obviously, we have the final solution as well, which leads to the Nuremberg trials, and Samaan makes a big deal about how the Americans, the Soviets, and the British were mostly against the idea of a trial because they were hypocrites. They had many of the same eugenics policies as the Nazis did, and still believed in eugenics, so it didn't make sense to chastise the Nazis for implementing what they themselves had believed in and started implementing. The British government and public and the American public wanted to just execute the criminals, and it was only at Truman's insistence that the trial went ahead. The American prosecution was presented with problems though, especially at the doctors' trial in 1946 and 1947. They couldn't use the word eugenics, because that would mean that the Allies were guilty as well. In defence, the Germans simply produced all the texts and laws created by American and British doctors and lawmakers as their source for eugenic knowledge. And the prosecution also couldn't accuse the Germans of conducting genocide, as Hitler had targeted his own people, meaning it wasn't just genocide, it was actually eugenocide. So, unable to accuse the Germans of eugenocide, the American prosecution used the term thanatology instead, which obviously wasn't as effective. In defence, the Germans showed that the USA, Britain, France, the Netherlands, and many other countries had also performed dangerous medical experiments on prisoners without their consent. And unable to target eugenics, the prosecution backtracked, which ultimately led to the German doctors and intellectuals being set free. Samaan says that the omission of the word eugenics has gone largely unnoticed by Holocaust historians, even though the American prosecution used the term thanatology in their opening statements at the trial, a clear indication that something was up. Samaan says that the Rockefeller Foundation was pro-eugenics, and many of the men at the trial, as well as the US Secretary of State, were Rockefeller men and women. He says it's obvious that the American prosecution couldn't do their job because the American and German medical and legal communities were two sides of the same coin. Even one of the judges felt that the trials were unjustly administered. Worse, the criminals went free and were able to continue their experiments, even working with the international organisations that had aided and abetted the Nazis. Former National Socialist physician, SS member and war criminal Hans-Joachim Severing even became president of the World Medical Association in 1992. Samaan concludes by saying that the land of poets and thinkers committed the crimes precisely because it was a land of poets and thinkers, and those poets and thinkers were never punished. This is a similar conclusion to what Peikoff and others have come to as well, and I'm not against this conclusion because that genuinely does appear to be the case. We still buy into the excuse given by Hitler's henchmen at the Nuremberg trials. We still operate on the myth of Adolf Hitler as the supernatural boogeyman, the Antichrist, the magician, who is able to convince millions of otherwise sophisticated and cultured Germans into committing the most unspeakable crimes. The history we are told is more like the plot of some comic book, where a supervillain is spewed out of the depths of hell to use his supernatural powers to wreak havoc upon defenseless humanity. Ironically enough, it is the bombastic nature of this myth that has prepared a fertile ground for Holocaust deniers. The idea that the Holocaust was an unanticipated outcome of a single man's will remains a fraudulent view of history, which has served only to cover up a more horrid reality and allow for the most ludicrous speculation to pass off as actual history. I actually agree with this. I do think the current narrative helps the Holocaust deniers, and I've done videos on this before. And Samaan quotes from Christian Poss, who says, "Anti-Semitism and racism can no longer be identified as the sole driving forces behind Nazi politics, nor can the Nazi power elite be viewed as a small group of deviant monsters who misled a supposedly passive constituency." But with all this in mind, is Samaan correct overall? Well, for the sake of brevity, I've had to leave so much out of this video, and I hope you'll take that into consideration as I give this verdict, because there's a lot more evidence presented in the book that backs up Samaan's case. And so with that factor in mind, I actually think he's correct in terms of the laws of the right being copies of or influenced by American law. And I think the international eugenics movement is a real thing that definitely had an impact on the history of the Third Reich, as well as other crimes against humanity committed by the Americans, British and Soviets. That said, I'm not sure about other parts of Samaan's narrative. While I'm happy to suggest that you guys read it from an intellectual curiosity standpoint, I'm not happy with the way that Samaan wrote this book. It should not have been written from the present to the past, it should have been written in chronological order, and because it isn't, I suspect foul play. By the time you get to Charles Darwin and the origins of the eugenics movement, which should be at the beginning but is actually at the end of the book, you've bought into his narrative. And then he fires off a bunch of questionable statements about Charles Darwin being a eugenicist and creationist. This really does leave me skeptical as to whether Samaan's narrative on the origins of the eugenics movement, or the lessons we should gain from that, are correct. I also agree with Richards and others that National Socialism is a religion, whose origins don't start with Darwin, but with actually Heraclitus and Plato. So even if we accept that eugenics was to blame for the crimes and that Darwin was at fault for creating that movement, clearly the origins go back much earlier than that, and so to blame Darwin as the originator would be incorrect. It might be a better argument to state that the eugenics movement, though taking influence from Darwin and science, was a spiritualist movement that has much different and far more ancient roots than Samaan presented, but that this spirituality did create the romanticist conditions that led ultimately to the eugenics of the 20th century. In order for me to make this a concrete conclusion though, I'd need to do a deeper dive, which means I need to see what you guys think first. Do you think there's something to this narrative? Are you interested in me doing more research behind the scenes and covering this again once I've done more reading? Or is this something you think I should ignore, or, for whatever reason? Am I onto something, or is this just a nonsense narrative of the ancient aliens variety? I'll decide what to do once you guys are giving me feedback. So comment below and let me know, and I'll leave it there. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.